So as we continue through our course, we're now bridging from the modern period into the postmodern period. So if you remember, we started all the way back in the pre-modern, and we looked at theism and deism. Then we transitioned to modern, where we looked at naturalism and materialism. And now we're looking at the postmodern period and focusing primarily on existentialism. So the most important kind of framework that we can work from in the early 20th century through the mid 20th century, when we start this postmodern period, are the world wars, right? So it's the era from 1914 to 1945. In this time period, you're going to see that violence and industrialized war really characterize the entire society. And it stems back all the way to the Russo-Japanese War of early 1900s. But if you see here, I have this list of all the wars and conflict that took place from that early 1900s all the way through 1945, right? And by the time we get to 1945, that's when we really enter that post-war period where the 20th century is really trying to just grapple with all of the death and loss that it's gone through during that 50-year period. So we always think of World War I and World War II as being these really important conflicts that dominate the early 20th century, but we should not forget that there were a number of other wars, including civil wars and other conflicts that took place during that time period, right? I mean, even within the world wars, we start to see revolutions, we start to see civil unrest. So if we think about the cost of war, just in general in human history, of the past 3,400 years, right? So if you go back from today to 3,400 years before that, right? So really the hallmarks of human civilization, right? We have only been at peace for less than 270 of those years, right? Or just about 8%. So war dominates human culture. So war is not a unique function of the 20th century. What is unique is the industrialization of war, or in other words, how efficient we become at killing people. And I say that because if we take just some really conservative estimates of how many people have died in wars throughout all of human history, researchers put that somewhere around 1 billion. Some go a little bit less with conservative numbers, but we're going to use around 1 billion people, right? So 1 billion people from all of human history have died from war. Of that billion, 108 million people were killed in World War I and World War II, right? 108 million people were killed in these conflicts that were framed by those two world wars and these other conflicts that go along with them. If you think about that, in that 50-year period, right, in that small period of time, compared to all of human history, 9% of all of the war-related deaths existed. So if humans have been around and conducting war for 35,000 years, 50,000 years, in a 50-year period, 10% almost of all the deaths existed. That's how tragic this time period was. That's how gross and sizable the death toll was. Okay. Keeping that in mind, then, it's no wonder human beings start to truly question everything they know about reality. So at some point, right, during these world war periods, and during this massive death toll of millions upon millions of people, society starts to question and really starts to abandon an idea that somehow the world and even humankind and society and the universe have order. It appears that there is no order. It appears that if there was some kind of divine structure to all of this, why would it allow so much death and so much carnage in such a short period of time? Prior to this period, right? Prior to this period, so if you go back to our materialism and our naturalist periods, you go back even further to our deist and our theist periods, there was a continual belief that there was a natural order to things, that life was not chaotic, that life wasn't just random. And because of that, especially in our deistic and our theistic time periods, people were known as essentialists, simply saying that they believed that they were born with some kind of purpose or meaning, maybe given by God or given by human nature, but given by genetics, but there was some kind of purpose or meaning embedded in things. And so that essence preceded existence, right? There was an essence to something. There was, like a ghost or a spirit or a soul within things and within people. After the war periods, philosophers start to question this. And a new group of philosophers known as the existentialists flip this. Instead of believing that essence precedes existence, that purpose and meaning precedes being born, right? That a soul or a purpose exists before becoming material in the world. Existentialists flip that and say existence precedes essence. Or in other words, you are born a clean slate, blank, without any purpose, without any meaning. And that by being born, you create your existence, right? That purpose and meaning are actually created by your choices, which those choices create who you are, create your character, your values, your purpose, your meaning in the world. Now, on the surface, this sounds like something that many people believe in today, right? And it's kind of comforting. It's saying, well, yeah, I have my own choices, I have my own free will, I make the decisions for my life and how I live. But one existential philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, or sometimes pronounced Sartre, thought that this was actually a burden, that freedom itself was a burden. Now, this is confusing to us often, right? Like we tend to think, well, freedom is a good thing, right? We live in a country where we celebrate freedom, and we expect to have freedom through our constitutional laws. And so to say that freedom is a burden doesn't seem to make any sense to us. But here is what Sartre was saying. He was saying that we are condemned to be free because we have so much freedom. There's so much an abundance of freedom that there is nothing that's meaningful then, right? There's nothing that we can share with one another because I'm free to make my own choices. You're free to make your own choices. We're all free to do whatever we want and however we want. Like, how do we actually create some meaning from that? And as an existentialist, remember, you're rejecting the idea that you're born with some kind of preordained essence. And the reason you're rejecting that is because you've just lived through several decades of the most tragic and horrific things that humans can do to one another, right? The most awful and terrible things that human beings can do to one another all seem to exist simultaneously in a very short period of time. And not even a full lifetime, right? In a half a person's lifetime. And so clearly there's so much freedom because there's even so much freedom that you can kill people on massive, horrific levels. So the burden of this freedom is that we can make all these our choices are our own. And because of that, we make these choices, and we often make really terrible ones. So then if there's no meaning or purpose in the universe, if there's nothing out there that's telling us how to live, what should we do? Well, Sartre actually says what you shouldn't do is just listen to your teachers or to your preachers, your ministers, or your parents, and just follow what they've told you to do, because that's not living with freedom, right? That's not living with choice. You're just doing what somebody else has given you, right? You're being manipulated. He argues that to truly live an authentic life, you have to make the determination for yourself what life means. What's the meaning of life? Why are you here? What's the purpose of existence? You have to independently discover that, work towards it, and then accept it and live by it. That's how you live authentically. And that's the burden. The burden is, this is not an easy thing to do. You think to those major questions like, why are we here? What's the meaning of life? Is there a God? If there is a God, what's he like? Is there life after death? These are the questions that every human being has struggled with all throughout time and through every culture across the world. And there's lots of answers to choose from. And Sartre says, you don't get just to pick one because someone told you to. You have to pick one because it is what authentically aligns with who you are as a person and your experiences and your knowledge and what you've learned. And he even argued that you would grow and continue to challenge these ideas as you live through your life. And that was living authentically. So in essence, what gives your life meaning can't be preordained or predetermined. You have to make that. If you take that kind of idea, this existential idea, and you compare it to the world wars, the argument then would be is that a lot of these people have made really terrible, awful determinations of what a moral or good life is. And the cost of that was that we lost all these people. Take that one step further. We lost all these people because they listened to these people. They listened to these authorities and just followed them blindly without questioning it. And because they didn't question it, we ended up with these massive atrocities. One way Sartre tries to illustrate this point is through kind of a story that he tells. So it's this like philosophical kind of question he poses. All right, so I'm going to take it down real briefly. I'm going to just get to the nuts and bolts of it. So the story goes that there's a son who is being called to go to war. And he believes in the cause. He believes in what he's doing. He believes that if he goes, he can make a difference. But he has an elderly mother who is very sick and will likely die if he leaves her and no longer takes care of her. So he's caught in this existential dilemma, right? This existential crisis. That crisis is, which one should he do? Which would give him the most purpose and meaning in his life? What is the right answer to the question? Should he go to war and do his duty to support the cause and support his country? Or should he stay and take care of his mother and make sure that she dies in comfort, knowing the last days with her son? Right? So if you think about this question, what would you say is the right answer? Well, it's a trick question because it's an existential question. The answer to that question is whichever decision the soldier's son makes, whichever choice the son makes, is the right choice as long as he does it authentically. And we actually don't know the answer to the question until he makes the choice. Because when he makes the choice, that's how we'll know what the right answer is, as long as he made it authentically. That's an existential crisis. Many of you are probably going through or have gone through existential crises in your life. You've tried to grapple with the big questions of meaning. Maybe you've had to grapple with grief and death. Maybe you're in the moment right now where you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with your life, right? What kind of major you should have, and what colleges you should go to, or universities you should go to, and what you should do as a career. These are existential life problems, and the issue is no one can give you the answer. According to Sartre, you have to determine it authentically. Existentialism is represented in lots of different art forms. And one of the most interesting art forms comes from literature. And some of the great literature of the 20th century was a direct reaction to existential crises, but also physical crises like these wars. So in the 20th century, a new term comes out. It's called dystopia. It's a modern invention. And what dystopia means is it's an imagined state or society in which there is great suffering or injustice, and typically one that is totalitarian or apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic, right? And this is simply a reaction to what's going on in the 20th century, right? And it's existential in the sense that it's trying to grapple with, why do people suffer? Why do people go through these massive kinds of things? All right. Dystopia is actually rooted in a very old word, utopia. And utopia is an imagined place or state of things in which everything is perfect. So utopia actually comes from the 1500s by an author named Sir Thomas More. Now, what's interesting is More was trying to write the perfect society. He made a couple of interesting choices. One, when he spelt the word utopia, he seems to have spelt it wrong. To truly capture a perfect world, the word utopia should have been spelled EUTOPIA, because EU, that prefix, means perfect. Just using the letter U as the prefix actually means nothing. So when More writes utopia, he's actually not writing perfect place, perfect imagined world. He's writing no place or no world. Now, the question scholars have asked is, did he do that on purpose or not? Was it simply a mistake because he didn't speak Latin well enough or Greek? Or is it because he did this intentionally to show that there is no such thing as a utopia. And the reason we ask this is because in More's utopia, it could be a dystopia for certain people. And that seems to be the problem. The problem seems to be that whenever you try to create a utopia, it's a dystopia for some and a utopia for others. So let me just give you a breakdown real quickly of utopia's rules. So More said to have a perfect society, healthcare and education should be universal. And he applied that to all people, including women. And at that time would have been very, groundbreaking to say that education should be universal. Everyone works at a leisurely rate, and all wants are tended to. So people kind of live on this island, and this island has these warehouses just full of all the resources that anybody would need, and everybody just kind of works at a leisurely rate. They work about 6 hours a day, 4 days a week, and they do what they love to do. And because there's enough people on the island, all the jobs are taken care of. And then you could actually rotate jobs as you get new education. And there is no money, you only get what you need. So there is no reason to like climb ladders or those kinds of things. In order to maintain this society, though, slavery has to exist. Now, this is interesting, right? Because in More's mind, a perfect world still has slaves. And because he recognizes there's going to be jobs and things that need to be done that people won't want to do. He also recognizes there has to be a punishment system for crime. Although it's a perfect world, someone's going to deviate from that, so we have to have some kind of punishment. So slaves are never bought. His distinction is that you don't purchase slaves. Slaves are either captured from enemy islands who don't live by utopian standards, or there are punishments for crime. In either case, slavery was not permanent and not lifelong. It usually had sort of a length of time on it, kind of like indentured servitude. But again, in this perfect world, we still need slaves, according to More. There's no premarital sex. And the punishment for that is that you cannot get married if you're caught having premarital sex. You're not allowed to get married until you're 18 if you're a girl and 22 if you're a boy. The terminally ill are encouraged to partake in euthanasia. So again, a very kind of out there idea for this time period, that he recognized that when someone was sick and in pain, the better thing to do was to try to convince them to kill themselves. And then he has rules about politics. There are no public campaigns, so you can't. He's got a long list of rules about how you can't do campaigns, you can't do stump speeches, you can't go around with certain materials. Obviously, More was reflecting on his own society at the time with a lot of corruption in politics, something that's still very relevant in our day and age. Office holders, he said, would be treated like fathers and mothers, therefore just given automatic respect. And there's no bribery because there is money. Okay, so this is More's idea of utopia. Now, if you look, I also have 3 images of some of the most despotic and tyrannical, dictators of the 20th century. So I've got Stalin, Mussolini, and Hitler. Now, it's someone asked, like, well, why would I put those along with utopia? And the easy answer is, oh, well, that's the comparison between utopia and dystopia. I'd caution you for a moment. The thinking here is, and a lot of scholars have said, especially some historians who kind of gone back and kind of re-looked at what's going on in the 20th century. The thinking here is that Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin did not set out to create dystopias. They did not set out to create a totalitarian or post-apocalyptic world, right? They set out to fix their broken countries, right? If you think about what these countries have gone through, Hitler is responding to the gross and economic issues of World War I into World War II. Stalin has just gone through the communist revolution and the overthrowing, the overthrowing of the monarchy. Mussolini's gone through something very similar in their own, and the rise of fascism. And so what we see here is these 3 dictators who are actually trying to create better countries. Now, do I condone their terrible and horrific actions? Absolutely not. But what we have to say is that, when leaders take control, it's probably not to make things awful, it's probably to make things better, right? They're probably a referendum on the previous administration or the previous kind of government. That is certainly true for these three. Now, in the process of trying to make a utopia, they create some of the most horrific dystopias we've ever seen. And some historians say that's inevitable, because when you try to make something perfect, inevitably what you do is you end up destroying certain things to try to make things better. And to do so, people tend to get hurt in that process, right? So in order for Hitler to boost his economy, consolidate power, he does two things. He picks on a specific group of people and robs them of their wealth and then eventually of their lives. And then he also conquers territory around him. Mussolini and Stalin have similar ideas, right? The conquering of territory around them would allow them to grab wealth. Well, that's very utopian. It's very much what More does, right? More says you go around and conquer other places that aren't like you, and then you would gather those slaves, because slavery is necessary for your to the running of your country. So here's the thing: can utopia and dystopia actually be separated, right? Or are they always together? Are they always sort of like a yin yang, the black and the white? In the black there is some white, in the white there is some black. Well, that question is taken up by three prominent authors of the early 20th century. The first one is Aldous Huxley, who wrote A Brave New World. And so he writes a dystopian novel, and he depicts that novel as a reflection of the society that he is living in. The novel was published in 1932, so we're talking about the period right between World War I and World War II. We're talking about the period of a lot of civil turmoil across the planet. And so his novel really is a reflection on the society of his day. So it starts with this kind of futuristic place called the World State, and time on the World State is measured after Ford. And he means Henry Ford, and that's actually a celebration of the assembly line and efficiency, because the entire world is built to be specifically designed as the most efficient way to operate. Because of that, citizens and the breeding of citizens are highly controlled. And that's really the whole premise of Brave New World, right? Emotions and individuality are actually conditioned out of people because everyone lives for the state. And then citizens are sorted as embryos to be different classes. Really, it's kind of like a caste system, right? So people actually don't breed, people actually don't have sex to procreate. Instead, people are created in laboratories, and those laboratories design the people based on the needs of the living society, right? And so there are different castes, and those are alpha, beta, gammas, deltas, and epsilons. And what they do is they insert certain chemicals in the alphas and the betas to make them better, and they insert other chemicals in the deltas and the epsilons to make them, lower, and literally lower in terms of like lower IQs. That lowers their lifespans. It lowers a lot of things, right? And so this is their society. It's a perfect harmonious society. You've got just enough leaders who are intelligent enough and charismatic enough and physically fit and beautiful. And then you've got the lower classes, which are designed to do the menial tasks of the menial laborers. Right? The plot follows the main character, Bernard Marx. That name is chosen specifically. And basically what Bernard does, along with his love interest, they go to a place called Savage Reservation. It's basically a human society that would be more like ours today, where people are kind of living in the way they choose. And there's no like state-controlled breeding system. People are just kind of born in natural ways. They're going there because Marx's boss supposedly lost a companion there years ago. When they get there, they find two people who they find this woman, Linda, who is from their own society, and her son, John. And they bring those people back to their society, and the savages, Linda and John, are appalled by the world that Bernard Marx lives in. And so the whole message here is that if you take efficiency to its natural end, right, the best thing that we would do would be to control everything. But to do that, really, changes what it means to be a human being. Is that really the best plan? One other part of the side effect of that is if you move procreation away from sex, what ends up happening in the Brave New World society is that sex is now just for entertainment. And in this society, people start to really seek like peak experiences. And so sex becomes very violent, violence becomes almost sexy. And the end scene of the book is very traumatic, right? The main character, or the character John, who was taken from the savage world, he is so appalled by what he is seeing in this world that he kind of goes into a fit of rage after his mother dies. And he starts self-flagellating, so whipping himself and then whipping another woman. And then people come to see the whipping and to watch it as like a spectacle, like, and they love watching this, and it incites some sexual activity and very passionate, and so it's very disturbing, right? And Huxley did that on purpose. Huxley was intentionally discussing what happens when our society gets controlled in this way. A similar novel written about a decade later by Orwell, 1984, is a very popular novel in today's culture. So much we talk about comes from 1984, right? Like a lot of the ideas of like propaganda and Big Brother's always watching, and how the media controls the way we think and talk. So all these ideas, they're all present in 1984. Now, this book was written in 1949, right? So this book was written during the World War II period. And a lot of people will say, wow, Orwell was really, kind of like an oracle or a prophet. He was able to predict the future. That's not true at all. Orwell was looking at his day and age at the time. He was looking at Mussolini and Stalin and Hitler, and he was looking at the way that they controlled the media and the way they controlled propaganda. And he was saying, this is happening in our world today. Now, he wrote a satire of it, kind of embellishing it or sort of exaggerating it in order to serve as a warning that if we didn't do something, that this would be the fate of the world, not just those three countries, right? Not just Italy, Germany, and Russia. So today we all say, well, wow, he was so good at predicting things. He wasn't predicting things. He was seeing what was happening in his own time. The fact that we didn't listen to his warnings, right? That's a failing of ours. That's a failing of our society, where we have allowed it to get as worse as he predicted it would be. That's because we have never listened to those warnings and never done anything to try to stop those things from happening, right? And so today's day and age of this heightened control and manipulation by powers, especially the way that the media is controlled and the way that almost thinking is controlled, that was starting to happen in the 40s, and it obviously up to today, it never really got checked. So the book is set in what he thought 1984, like the year 1984 would be, right? So he thought if things continue to go the way they would go, that powers would continue to consolidate, and that really there'd be basically three nations of the world kind of perpetually warring with each other, right? And so he lives in the country of Oceania, which most of us think that that's probably Britain, because that's where he was from, or maybe a combination of Britain and North America. So there's that idea. And then that country is consistently fighting with two other countries. Now, what's interesting is it doesn't matter. Those countries fight wars with each other, but they just kind of like switch sides here and there, and none of it matters. And they go from saying, Eurasia is our enemy to East Asia is being our friend, and then they flip that and like, no, actually, East Asia is our friend the whole time, and it's because the media controls the way everything works. And the media is controlled by the party, which is in turn controlled by the all-controlling Big Brother, who's this kind of like fictional, actually, leader of the party. All right, and the party creates like this propaganda through this language known as newspeak, in which they try to really limit free thought and really try to control the way people think by controlling the words they use. And they use slogans like "war is peace" and "freedom is slavery" and "ignorance is truth," ignorance is strength. See, some of these things certainly talk about like an existential kind of crisis, right? I mean, this idea that freedom is slavery certainly is reminiscent of what Sartre was talking about, that freedom is a burden. Now, the way things work is that if you control people's words, you control the way they think about those words, and you control the way they act and behave. And that's the entire plot of the story, is that one of these people who works in the newspaper industry eventually starts to reject the constructs of his world, and it ends pretty terribly for him at the end of the story. So 1984, very much like A Brave New World, is pointing out the issues of this, like, attempts of creating utopias in dystopian ways. And the last book I wanted to bring up was Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. If you don't know this, Ray Bradbury is actually a local guy, right? So he was born right here in Illinois, and that was actually a museum dedicated to up north. So he's kind of a homegrown figure, as well as kind of a hero across the dystopian novels, right? And so he writes Fahrenheit 451, which is kind of like the last one of the big three out of the 20th century. And this story focuses more on censorship than it does necessarily on like the totalitarian regimes. But in the process of creating that censorship, it stupefies people. And so the entire world has been kind of fireproofed, so no building burns unless someone chooses to burn it on purpose. And so firemen in this future don't actually put out fires, they actually start fires. And the reason they start fires is to burn books. It is illegal in this society to have books. And so the entire story follows the path of Guy Montag, who is a fireman. This guy's job is to go around and burning books that have been discovered in people's homes, right? And the interesting commentary that Bradbury is making here is that if you remove books, then people just kind of like don't really learn and don't really think, and they just kind of like exist in this really like kind of vapid and empty world. And so that's typified by Montag's wife, Mildred, who attempts to commit suicide, and then it seems very routine. Like, these guys show up, they're not even doctors, they pump her stomach, she's fine, she's okay, and they're treated almost like they're plumbers as opposed to like some kind of emotional support system. And it's because life just doesn't really have any meaning. She spends most of her day watching TV on these massive TVs that take up her entire wall. Some of the TVs are interactive, where she she participates as a character in the story. So it's sort of like a video game. And this is the world that she lives in. And Montag just kind of goes to work every day. And then when they call in a place that has books, they go and burn the books, and then he goes home, right? So this is life, right? This is life in Bradbury's novel. But eventually, Montag is shaken when he meets a few characters who have rejected this society and instead have embraced learning, right? And so one moment in the story, he meets this woman who won't give up her Bible, right? And she instead chooses to die with her books and be burned alive than to give up her books. And this really shakes him, and Montag doesn't know why that would happen. His captain, Captain Beatty, tries to explain why what Montag is doing is actually a good thing, right? And so he said that originally people started losing interest in reading, and then as television became more popular, and there were a lot of objections to certain books, and people started banning books, especially special interest groups, and these groups that were worried about people thinking the wrong ideas. So they start just saying, we're not going to learn, because by learning, that creates inequity and unhappiness, and so no one's allowed to read. And this was an argument that Bradbury was making, that he was seeing in his society in the 50s, right? This is the TV generation, that people were glued to the tube, so to speak, and not learning and reading for pleasure. All right, so now if you take that into context with the other two, we can really see, their commentary still holds water today, right? Literacy rates are down in this country, right? The average reading rate across the United States of America fluctuates between 4th and 5th grade. So that's a person who's graduated high school and is 7 or 8 years behind in their reading levels. very few people, read any books, let alone a book a year, right? So there's this, constant trend of anti-learning and then getting our information from really dubious sources. So if you take these three books together, you can certainly see how societies that are trying to control and make things better, make things utopia, they all backfire in terrible ways and create these dystopias. And then the question is that what we have done, right? Is that what Americans have done? Have we created a dystopian world because we try to control in these same kind of arenas, right? So Huxley's idea of efficiency, Orwell's idea of controlling media and controlling politics, and then Bradbury's idea of controlling learning and controlling literacy. All right, so we are shifting now from a materialistic worldview to an existential worldview, right? So in the last module, we talked a lot about materialism and this idea that there's a natural order to things, and that order is kind of pre-existent within the universe, and that all things are kind of made up of matter. We have like things like Darwin's evolution and Marx talking about how society is created, right? So we had this idea of what materialism was, right? And then in the micro lessons, we talked about Einstein and we talked about Picasso, how they were really challenging the way we see the world. Well, as World War II and it kind of comes to an end, the 20th century becomes typified by really these existential questions that they cannot answer. And that's really what the postmodern worldview becomes. It becomes just the sense of question, just the sense of challenging, right? Questioning what's happened before, questioning tradition, questioning anything that's happened in the prior generations, and wondering, can we really trust that? Because look what happened. Look at how terrible World War I and World War II were. Look what the cost of human life was. And so we start to leave this very like materialistic worldview where we start focusing just like the matter and science of things. And we start to get back into sort of like a soul or mental view to try and understand, what does it mean to exist in this world?